Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Insomnia Forest. Tonight we have another terrifying story that will take you deep into the darkness, where every shadow hides a secret and every whisper carries a warning. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and leave a comment below. Your support helps the forest grow. Now, turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let's enter the forest together. My name is Daniel Herzog. I am 47 years old, and I have worked as a backcountry ranger with the United States Forest Service for 19 years, the last 11 of those assigned to the Pisgah Ranger District in western North Carolina. I am writing this account at the request of my district supervisor, who suggested that putting events down in writing might help me process them. I do not believe it will, but I owe him the attempt. I will try to be precise. I will try to leave out nothing relevant and to add nothing that I cannot defend. The assignment was routine. On the morning of October the 23rd, I was called into the district office in Brevard and briefed on a 5-day solo patrol of the Shining Rock Wilderness, with particular focus on the section of the old Butt Knob Trail between Shining Rock Gap and the lower switchbacks near Dog Loser Knob. A series of late October storms had moved through the region the week before, and aerial reconnaissance by a contract pilot had identified at least 11 significant blowdowns along that corridor. My job was to walk the trail, document the damage with photographs and GPS waypoints, clear what I could with a hand crosscut and a pruning saw, and flag anything that would require a chainsaw crew. There was no urgency to it. Hunting season was still 2 weeks out, and through traffic on that stretch in late October is essentially zero. I left Brevard at 6:14 in the morning on October the 24th. The truck thermometer read 41 degrees at the office and dropped to 36 by the time I parked at the Big East Fork trailhead on Highway 215. I performed my standard pre-departure inventory at the tailgate. Pack weight was 41 pounds dry, closer to 46 with the 4 liters of water I drew from the cooler. I carried a 4-season tent, a synthetic fill bag rated to 20 degrees, an MSR stove, 5 days of dehydrated meals, 2 energy bars in excess of what I would need, a full first aid kit, a personal locator beacon registered to my name, a service radio with a fresh battery and 1 spare, 2 paper topographic quadrangles, a compass, and the saws. My phone was switched off and zipped into a chest pocket. There is no cellular service in that part of the forest, and I have learned not to carry the temptation of a screen into the woods. I signed the trailhead register at 6:51. The previous entry was dated October the 19th, 4 days earlier, and listed 2-day hikers headed up Greasy Cove. There were no overnight parties signed in. I noted the names of the previous hikers in case I encountered any of the gear or trash on the trail. I also noted the weather, which the regional forecast had listed as clear, with a high near 52 and an overnight low of 29. No precipitation expected for at least 72 hours. There was a light wind from the northwest, perhaps 4 to 6 miles per hour, moving steadily through the upper canopy. I want to record here at the beginning that I felt nothing unusual at the trailhead. I was in good health. I had slept 7.5 hours the night before. My wife and I had eaten dinner together, talked about her sister's upcoming visit, and gone to bed without argument or worry. I was not depressed. I was not anxious. I had no recent history of head injury, no medication of any kind, no caffeine that morning beyond a single cup of coffee from the gas station in Pisgah Forest. I mention these things because I have been asked about them since, and because I want it understood that I went into the woods that day as a healthy, rested, experienced field officer with 19 years of solo backcountry work behind me. Whatever happened in there did not begin with me. The Big East Fork Trail begins at an elevation of roughly 3,200 feet and follows the eastern fork of the Pigeon River upstream for the first 2 miles before climbing northward into the higher country. The trail surface in the lower section is a mixture of root, duff, and packed mineral soil, with occasional stone steps placed by trail crews over the past several decades. I walked the first mile without incident. The river was running clear and somewhat low for the season. I counted 3 eastern hemlocks still standing along the bank, 2 of them young enough that I made a note to flag them for the Forest Health Survey. The hemlocks in that watershed are mostly gone now, killed off by the woolly adelgid over the last 20 years, and I have made it a habit to record the survivors. I reached the first of the recorded blowdowns at 8:46 in the morning, near the second crossing of the East Fork. It was a mid-sized red oak, approximately 18 inches at the base, lying across the trail at a low angle. I photographed it, recorded the waypoint, and spent about 40 minutes cutting through it with the crosscut. The work was unremarkable. The wood was sound and dry. I noted no sign of insect damage. When I had finished, I rolled the cut sections off the tread and continued upstream. It was during the rest break after that first piece of work at approximately 9:31 that I heard the first of what I will call, for lack of a better term, the sounds that did not belong. I want to be careful here because I am aware of how this kind of account tends to be received, and I want to give the reader every opportunity to dismiss what I write as misinterpretation. I am willing to be dismissed. I am not willing to lie. The sound I heard at 9:31 was a knock, a single, sharp, deliberate knock, as if someone had struck a piece of seasoned hardwood once with the back of an axe head. It came from upslope of my position, somewhere to the northeast, at a distance I would estimate at between 60 and 100 yards. I was sitting on the cut section of the oak I had just finished, drinking water, and the sound was clear enough that I lowered the bottle and turned my head toward it. I waited. In my experience, a single woodpecker strike against a hollow trunk can produce a knock of that quality, and a heavy branch falling and striking another branch on the way down can produce something similar. Either would normally be followed by other sounds, the woodpecker resuming its work, or the branch settling against the ground. I heard nothing. I waited a full 2 minutes by my watch. The wind continued in the upper canopy. A chickadee called twice from the rhododendron at the river's edge. The river itself ran with its steady, low autumn sound. There was no second knock. I made a note in my field log with the time and the bearing, and I continued upstream. I want to emphasize that I did not find the knock itself disturbing. Sounds without obvious sources are common in the woods, and a careful listener will hear them constantly. The reason I noted it was that I had been listening intentionally during the rest break, which is a habit I developed years ago, and I had been certain that there was no animal activity in that direction at that moment. A pileated woodpecker working a snag would have given me other indicators. The knock had come, as it were, out of an attentive silence. The second blowdown was a yellow birch at 10:42, well off the trail, requiring only that I flag the area with surveyor's tape and note it for the chainsaw crew. The third was a smaller poplar that I cleared in 23 minutes with the pruning saw and the bow saw I had on a sling. By 12:30, I had reached the junction with the Greasy Cove Trail and stopped for lunch. I ate a cold lunch, as I usually do at midday, a flatbread, some hard cheese, a handful of dried apricots. I took my boots off, aired my feet, and changed my socks. The weather had warmed to perhaps 48 degrees, and there was thin, high cloud beginning to drift in from the west, which I noted in my log because the forecast had not called for it. At 1:07, while I was lacing my boots back up, I heard the second sound. This one was different. It was a voice, or rather, it was something that had the shape of a voice without any of the qualities that would let me identify it. It came from across the river, perhaps 40 yards from where I sat, and it consisted of 2 syllables, low and brief, in a register I would call adult and male, but cannot describe more precisely than that. The 2 syllables did not form a word that I recognized. They did not, in fact, sound like English at all, but they had the cadence of speech, the natural rise and fall of someone saying something to someone else in passing. I will admit that this one did unsettle me, in a small way, in the moment. There were no signed-in parties in the area. The 2-day hikers from October the 19th had been going up Greasy Cove, but they had not signed out, which is common but not universal, and even if they had spent 5 nights in the wilderness, which would be unusual, they should not have been on this side of the river at this hour. I stood up, scanned the far bank carefully through the bare trees, and saw nothing. No movement, no color, no sound of footfall. The understory across the river was open enough that I should have seen a person walking, even at 40 yards. I called out twice. The standard backcountry hail. There was no response. I waited 5 minutes. Nothing further came from across the river. I noted the incident in my log with the time and bearing, and after some thought, I added a short note that the bearing of the voice and the bearing of the morning's knock, when plotted on the map, fell along roughly the same line. I continued upstream. I want to record that I considered at that point whether the line of bearing was meaningful or whether I was constructing a pattern out of 2 data points, which is the kind of error any tired observer can make. I decided it was almost certainly the latter. 2 bearings do not make a line in any meaningful sense. They make a coincidence. I am, by training and disposition, suspicious of meaningful coincidences. I cleared 2 more small blowdowns in the afternoon, both of them straightforward. The cloud cover thickened slightly, and by 4 in the afternoon, the light in the cove had taken on the muted, even quality that signals the approach of evening, even when the sun has not yet started to drop. I reached my intended campsite at 4:47, a flat shelf of duff and exposed root above a bend in the river, used often enough that there was a stone ring with old ash in it, and a clear bare hang tree about 30 yards downhill of the level ground. I set up camp methodically. The tent went up first, then the bear bag was rigged with the food and the toothpaste, then the stove was prepared for dinner. I drew water from the river, filtered it, and treated it with a chlorine dioxide tablet for the second night's drinking supply. I ate a hot meal of lentils and rice from a freeze-dried packet, drank a cup of black tea, and sat on the log near the stone ring writing up the day's log entries. By 6:23, the light was failing. By 6:48, it was full dark, and the air had cooled enough that I could see my breath. I made a final round of the campsite, secured the bear bag, and went into the tent. I read for perhaps 30 minutes by headlamp, an old paperback I had read before, and I was asleep by 7:45. I want to record that I slept well that night, with no disturbance. It is only because that first night was uneventful that what came afterward struck me the way it did. I woke at 5:22 on the morning of October the 25th to the sound of the river. The temperature inside the tent was 28 degrees by the small thermometer I keep clipped to the ridge line. The temperature outside was almost certainly colder. I broke down camp slowly, allowing the worst of the frost to come off the rainfly before I packed it, and I was on the trail with breakfast eaten and the water filtered by 7:34. The morning's work took me up the trail another 2 miles, into the higher and more open country where the cove hardwoods give way to scrubbier oak and pitch pine on the ridge spines, with rhododendron thick in the draws. I cleared 3 more blowdowns in the morning, photographed and waypointed 2 larger ones that would require the chainsaw crew, and reached the junction with the Old Butt Knob Trail at 11:46. The Old Butt Knob is a steep trail. It climbs roughly 1,400 feet in a little under 2 miles, with switchbacks in the upper section and exposed quartzite ledges near the top. It is also the section of trail I had been sent specifically to assess. Most of the storm damage from the aerial photographs was here, and the work would be slower because of the grade. I ate a second small meal at the junction, drank water, and started up. The first half-mile climbed gradually through mixed hardwoods. The second half-mile pitched up sharply, and I began to feel the weight of the pack and the saws in my legs and lower back, which is normal at my age and on that grade. I stopped twice in the next hour for water breaks, both times remaining standing because once I sat down on a steep grade with that much pack weight, it became difficult to start again. At 1:18 in the afternoon, when I was perhaps 2/3 of the way up the steepest section, I heard the third sound. This one I will try to describe in detail because it is the first of the sounds that I cannot, even now, place in any familiar category. It came from above me on the trail, perhaps 50 to 70 feet up the slope, and it had the duration and the rhythm of footsteps on loose gravel. 3 or 4 short, scuffing impacts, evenly spaced, in the cadence of a person walking. The trouble was that there is no gravel on that section of the Old Butt Knob Trail. The tread there is duff and root and occasionally bare bedrock. There is no surface within several hundred yards on which a footstep would make that sound. I stopped where I was. I looked up the slope. The trail bent to the left around an outcrop of quartzite about 40 feet ahead, so I could not see the section above the bend without continuing. I waited. I heard the sound again, this time closer. 3 short, scuffing impacts in the same cadence, with the same wrong texture. They sounded like someone walking on a gravel driveway in a section of forest that had no driveway and no gravel. I called out the standard hail. There was no answer. I want to record that I did not feel fear at this point, so much as professional irritation. The most likely explanation in my mind was that another hiker had come up from the Daniel Boone Boy Scout camp side of the wilderness, ignored the trailhead register, and was now on the trail above me. The sound was wrong for the surface, but my ears are 47 years old. An acoustic reflection in steep, rocky terrain can do strange things. I expected when I came around the bend to see a backpacker, probably a young man, probably embarrassed about the unregistered entry, and I expected to give him a polite but firm reminder about the registration requirement. I continued up the trail. I came around the bend in the quartzite at 1:24. The section above was empty. The trail ran on for perhaps 80 feet to the next switchback. There was no person on it. There was no movement in the brush on either side. There were no fresh boot prints in the duff. I walked the entire visible section of trail and examined the tread carefully. The only boot prints I found were my own, made minutes earlier, and a much older set of prints, partly washed out by rain, which I judged from their condition to be at least a week old. The older set went up the trail. They did not come back down. I stood at the next switchback for a long time, perhaps 4 or 5 minutes. I listened. The wind had dropped to almost nothing. There were no bird calls. The forest at that elevation in late October is not silent exactly, but it is quiet in a way that you become attuned to over years. And what I noticed standing there was that the quiet had a different quality than the quiet I had walked through 10 minutes earlier. I would not have called it unnatural then. I would have called it close. I made a long entry in my field log. I recorded the time, the bearing, the description of the sound, the absence of any physical evidence of another person, and the older boot prints. I noted that the older boot prints belonged to a tread pattern I did not recognize, with a distinctive horizontal bar across the heel. I would normally have photographed them, But my hands were cold by then, and I was conscious of the time and the remaining climb. And I made the decision, which I have since regretted, to photograph them on the way back down the next day. I did not get the chance to do so. I continued the climb. I cleared one small blowdown in the upper switchbacks and reached the open ridge near Shining Rock at 3:42 in the afternoon. The view from the ridge that afternoon was the long view I have seen many times, the black mountains on the horizon to the north, and the rumpled spine of the Pisgah Ledge running off to the southwest, lit with the gold of low autumn sun. I stood on the quartz outcrop and looked east. The light was beautiful, and the air was cold and clean. I want to record that I felt, at that moment, no particular sense of dread. It was only when I turned to walk down toward the second campsite that I noticed the second thing I cannot fully account for. My shadow, on the open quartz of the ridge, was lying in the wrong direction. The sun, at 3:42 on October the 25th in western North Carolina, was in the southwestern quadrant of the sky and dropping. I was facing roughly east when I noticed it, having just turned away from the view. My shadow, by all expected geometry, should have lain in front of me and slightly to my right, falling to the east-northeast across the white stone. It was not there. It was behind me, falling to the west, in the direction of the sun. I am aware of how this sounds. I want the reader to understand that I do not put it forward as a thing I believe happened. I put it forward as a thing I saw, or thought I saw, for a period I estimate at between 2 and 4 seconds. I turned my head to look directly at it. I lifted my hand. The hand cast a shadow on the rock that was geometrically consistent with the position of the sun, falling to the east-northeast at my feet. I looked again at the longer shadow behind me. It was no longer there. My full shadow, head to boot, was now in front of me and slightly to the right, exactly where it should have been. I stood on the ridge for some time after that. I would estimate 10 minutes, although I did not check my watch. I performed a number of small tests. I turned in different directions and watched my shadow track around me, which it did normally. I held my arms out and watched the shadows of my hands, which behaved as shadows of hands should behave. I picked up a small stone and dropped it, and watched the shadow of the stone fall in the direction it was supposed to fall. Everything I tested produced shadows that were consistent with the position of the sun. I considered the most likely explanations. The first was that I had been mistaken about my orientation when I turned around. This is a banal explanation, and one I would normally accept, but I had been looking at a recognized landmark in the east, the prominent dome of Cold Mountain, for several minutes before I turned. I was not disoriented. The second was that the long shadow behind me had not been my shadow at all, but the shadow of some feature of the ridge behind me, falling at an angle that happened to mimic the shape of a person. The ridge behind me, when I checked, was lower than I was. Nothing on it could have cast a shadow toward the west at that hour. The third explanation, which I do not like, was that I had simply seen a thing that was not there, in the manner of an optical illusion or a brief perceptual error. I want to say something about that third explanation. Perception is not what most people think it is. Most people imagine that we see the world directly, as if our eyes were windows. We do not. We construct the world we see moment by moment out of fragments of sensory input and a great deal of prediction. Most of the time, the prediction is so good and so well tested that the construction feels seamless. Occasionally, under the right conditions of fatigue or low light or unusual geometry, the prediction goes wrong, and we see briefly and vividly something that is not there. Every experienced field officer has had at least one such experience. I have had several. They are interesting and they are unsettling, but they are not, in themselves, evidence of anything beyond the ordinary failure modes of the human visual system. I told myself this on the ridge at length, and I believed it. I still believe it, mostly. What I noticed at the time, and what I want to record now, is that this was the first incident in the trip that I could not write off as an external sound or a misidentified bearing. It was a thing my own eyes had done, which meant that, if I was going to be honest with myself, I had to consider that some of the earlier incidents might also have been things my own ears had done, and not things in the woods around me. That thought was not comforting. I would rather have believed there was an unregistered hiker on the trail. I came down off the ridge at 4:11 and made for the designated tent site at Shining Rock Gap, which I reached at 4:38. It is a flat patch of ground in a stand of red spruce and yellow birch, sheltered from the wind, with a stone ring for cooking. The sun had dropped behind the higher ground to the west, and the temperature was falling quickly. I set up the tent in the lengthening shadow of the spruce, rigged the bear bag, and got the stove going for an early dinner. I ate while there was still some light. I drank a second cup of tea. I wrote in my log. I want to record exactly what I wrote, because I think the honesty of it matters. I wrote that I had heard sounds during the day that I could not fully account for, that I had also experienced a brief visual anomaly involving my own shadow on the ridge, that I was probably tired and that the cumulative effect of carrying a heavy pack at elevation was probably contributing, and that I would continue the assessment as planned, but would pay closer attention to my hydration and rest the following day. I did not write the word afraid. I was not afraid. I was attentive, and I was a little tired, and I was watching myself carefully. By 6:30, the light was gone. The temperature had dropped below freezing. I went into the tent earlier than I had the night before because there was nothing else to do. I read for perhaps an hour. I noticed that the small noises of the forest at night, and the settling of cold air through the spruce needles, the occasional movement of a small animal in the duff, were all present and accounted for. I have always found these sounds reassuring. I was reassured. I fell asleep at approximately 8:15. I woke at 1:42 in the morning of October the 26th to a silence I had never heard before in the woods. I want to be careful about that statement because it is the kind of statement that tends to be taken as more dramatic than I mean it. I mean it precisely. There is always sound in the woods at night. Even on the coldest, stillest nights, there is the breath of one's own body in the tent. The small expansion and contraction of the tent fabric against the poles as the temperature shifts, the occasional creak of a branch settling under its own load, the distant calls of owls, the rustle of mice or shrews in the leaf litter. Even when the wind is dead and there is no animal activity within hearing, there is a baseline hum to the forest at night, a kind of low subliminal noise floor that you do not notice until it is gone. At 1:42 on the morning of October the 26th, it was gone. I lay in the tent for a long time before I moved. I did not move because I was afraid. I did not move because I was confused. I was, in those first minutes, simply trying to identify what was wrong, because I could feel that something was wrong before I had finished waking up enough to name it. When I named it, I was certain that I had named it correctly. The sound floor of the forest had dropped to zero. I could hear my own breathing. I could hear my own pulse in my ears, slow and steady. I could hear, very faintly, the brush of my hair against the synthetic surface of the sleeping bag hood when I moved my head. Those sounds were all present. They were also the only sounds. There was no wind. There was no settling of the tent. There was no creaking of trees. There were no animals, no insects, no distant water. The river was perhaps a half-mile downhill of the campsite, and would not normally have been audible from inside the tent at that distance. But on the previous night, lying still at this same hour, I had been able to hear the very faint suggestion of moving water, the way you sometimes can if you have lived around running water long enough. That suggestion was absent. I checked my watch. The time was 1:43. I had been lying still for approximately a minute. I want to record that I did not, at this point, panic. I did not even particularly become afraid. I was extremely alert, and I was extremely curious. I asked myself quietly what set of physical conditions would produce a silence of this completeness, and I went through the list mentally. A heavy fog or low cloud sometimes dampens the soundscape considerably, but it does not eliminate it. A snow event would have woken me earlier with the sound of falling snow. A temperature inversion can produce strange acoustic effects, but not silence of this kind. The only natural condition I could think of that would produce something close to this was a deep snowpack on a windless night in the high country. And I had no snowpack, and was not in country high enough for one. I sat up in the bag. The synthetic shell whispered against itself. The whisper sounded loud to me. I unzipped the bag halfway. The zipper sounded loud. I reached for my headlamp on the pad next to me, and the small click of the switch sounded loud. I shone the headlamp around the inside of the tent. Everything was as I had left it. I unzipped the tent door slowly and put my head out into the vestibule. The headlamp showed the inside of the vestibule, my pack, my boots, the small folded square of my map. Beyond the vestibule was the rest of the campsite. I shone the headlamp out across it. The beam caught the dark trunks of the spruce, the gleam of the cooking pot I had left propped against the stone ring, the dull silver line of the bear bag's cord running up into the canopy. There was no movement. There was no animal in the cone of light. There was no fog. There was no falling snow. There was no sound. I stayed in that position for perhaps 2 minutes. The temperature against my face was bitter, well below freezing. My breath puffed out in small white clouds that hung in the headlamp beam and dissipated. I should have been able to hear my breath. I could hear it inside my own head, the way one always can, but I could not hear it as an external sound. The forest was not absorbing it. The forest was simply not there acoustically. I retreated into the tent. I zipped the door shut. I sat on the pad with the bag pulled around my hips and considered my options. The most rational thing to do, I decided, was nothing. I was warm, and I was dry, and I was uninjured. I had food and water for 3 more days. The temperature outside was below freezing, and the trail down was steep and exposed in sections. Attempting to break camp and descend at 2 in the morning in this kind of cold, in country where I had earlier in the day been doubting my own perceptual reliability, would be the action of a man who had lost his judgment. I had not lost my judgment. I would remain in the tent. I would lie down. If I could sleep, I would sleep. If I could not, I would wait for first light, and I would reevaluate then. This was the decision I made at 1:48. I want to record it precisely, because it was the first of the decisions in this assignment for which I have had reason since to question my own reasoning. At the time, it seemed obvious. It still seems obvious. I have gone over it many times in the months since, and I cannot fault the reasoning. I was a 47-year-old man in the woods at 2 in the morning with 3 more days of food and a working radio and a personal locator beacon. And I had not yet seen or heard anything that posed an actual threat. To activate the beacon and call out a search and rescue helicopter at that point would have been an act of extreme professional embarrassment and possibly career-ending. To attempt a night descent of the old butt knob would have been actively dangerous. I lay down. I closed my eyes. I did not sleep. I lay there in the silence for a long time and listened to my own pulse and waited for the silence to break. It broke at 3:14 in the morning, although not in a way I would have wished. What broke the silence was a single footstep. It came from outside the tent, on the duff perhaps 4 or 5 feet from the wall of the rainfly in the direction of the bear bag tree. It was an unmistakable footstep. The soft, compressive sound of a booted foot, or a heavy paw coming down on cold leaves and pressing them into the moisture of the soil beneath. It was not the lighter, drier sound of a deer's hoof, nor the quick scuttling of a smaller mammal. It was a single, deliberate, heavy compression of the duff in the manner of a person walking carefully. I lay perfectly still. The sound of my own pulse, which had been slow before, was now considerably faster. I could feel it in my throat. I was no longer in the calm state of inquiry I had been in an hour before. I was a man lying in a thin nylon tent in sub-freezing temperatures, listening to what sounded very much like another person standing 4 feet away from his head. There was a second footstep, then a third. They were spaced approximately a second apart, and they moved in a slow arc around the tent. I tracked them by the changing direction of the sound. They came from the bear bag side of the campsite, moved around toward the stone ring, paused for perhaps 4 seconds near the cooking pot, and then continued around behind the tent. When they passed behind the tent, I could hear the small crackle of one boot or foot brushing against the low limb of a young spruce. The crackle was clear and crisp and entirely consistent with the physical structure of the campsite. Whatever was walking, it knew where the obstacles were. The footsteps completed approximately 3/4 of a circle and stopped near the tent door. I want to record exactly what I did in the moments that followed. I unzipped the sleeping bag with the slowest, quietest motion I could manage. I freed my arms from the bag. I picked up the headlamp from the pad next to me and held it in my left hand without turning it on. I picked up the folding knife from my belt, which I had laid beside the pad, and held it closed in my right hand, with my thumb on the opening stud. I did not open the knife. I did not turn on the headlamp. I lay there with both objects in my hands, and I listened. I will note here, for the record, that the knife and the headlamp were not chosen as weapons or as deterrents. They were chosen because they were the 2 objects within reach that would allow me, if necessary, to do something. If I had to leave the tent in an emergency, I would need light. If I had to defend myself from a bear, which is the only animal in those woods that would pose a threat to a man in a tent, I would want something in my hand other than my fingers. I did not believe I was about to be attacked by a bear. I knew the sound of a bear in a campsite. This was not it. I also did not believe I was about to be attacked by a person. There was no reason for anyone at 3 in the morning, in sub-freezing temperatures, miles from any road, to be circling a ranger's tent. But I am a man who prepares for the things he can prepare for, and so I prepared. Whatever was standing near the tent door stood there for what my watch later told me was 4 minutes and 12 seconds. I would have estimated at the time that it stood there for half an hour. During those 4 minutes and 12 seconds, I heard nothing further. There were no breath sounds. There was no shifting of weight from one foot to another. There was no rustle of clothing. There was no smell, and I wanted to note this specifically because a bear, a person, or any large mammal at that distance, in a still and frozen air, would have had some smell, and I am a man who has spent many nights in the woods and who knows what the woods normally smell like at 3 in the morning in October. There was the smell of cold spruce. There was the smell of the dead ash in the stone ring. There was no other smell. What I am describing is the absence of any of the sensory signatures of a living thing standing 4 feet from my head, paired with the presence of a sequence of footsteps that had unambiguously brought a living thing to that position. After 4 minutes and 12 seconds, the footsteps resumed. They moved away from the tent in the direction they had come from, retracing the arc around the campsite. I tracked them by sound. They passed the stone ring, past the bare bag tree, and continued out of the campsite to the north, into the open woods toward the upper end of the ridge. The last footstep I could identify with confidence was perhaps 30 yards out. After that, the sound either faded into distance or stopped. I cannot tell which. When it was gone, the silence returned. The same complete silence I had woken into. I lay there in it for a long time, with the unopened knife in one hand and the unlit headlamp in the other. At some point, I became aware that I was extremely cold, that my arms were outside the bag, and that I was shivering. I put the knife and the headlamp down. I got back into the bag. I zipped it up. I lay there and I waited for first light. The silence held until approximately 5:50 in the morning. At 5:50, in the faintest gray of pre-dawn, I heard a single distant chickadee call from somewhere down the slope, and after the chickadee, a barred owl far off gave its slow, descending whinny. The sound floor of the forest came back, very gradually, over the next 20 minutes. By the time I sat up at 6:14 to begin breaking camp, the soundscape had returned to what I would call normal. Wind in the spruce. The river audible as a suggestion. Small animals at first light. I went out of the tent and examined the ground around the campsite carefully. I had a good flashlight and the rising light to work with. I spent perhaps 40 minutes on the inspection. The duff outside the tent was undisturbed. There were no boot prints. There were no animal tracks. There was no compression of the dead leaves where anything had stood. The small spruce limb behind the tent, the one I had heard crackle against the passing figure, was intact, with no broken needles. The ground beneath it was undisturbed. I considered the possibility that I had dreamed the footsteps. I considered it seriously. I had been awake when I heard them, or so I believed. But there is a known phenomenon in which a person who has been lying still for a long time in the dark can drift into a state of light dreaming without recognizing the transition. The dream content can be vivid and can incorporate the sensory environment of the dreamer in a way that feels indistinguishable from waking perception. I have never personally experienced this, but I know that it occurs. I would have welcomed that explanation. The trouble was that the silence which I had observed in detail in the minutes before the footsteps began had been an unambiguously waking experience. I had checked my watch repeatedly. I had moved my arms and tested the sound of the sleeping bag. I had operated the headlamp. I had looked out into the campsite with my own eyes. Whatever else I may or may not have dreamed, the silence was not a dream. And if the silence was not a dream, the footsteps within it had been heard while I was awake. I broke camp at 6:51 in the morning and started down the trail. The descent of the old butt knob in the early morning of October the 26th was the slowest descent of that trail I have ever made, and not because of the conditions. The conditions were excellent. The temperature was in the low 20s, the trail surface was frozen and firm, and the visibility was clear. I moved slowly because I was watching everything. I want to be precise about what I mean by watching everything. I do not mean that I was nervous, although I was. I mean that I was attempting, with whatever attention I could muster after a long, sleepless night, to verify the world around me as I moved through it. I looked at my shadow at every change in the trail's orientation. It behaved correctly. I listened to the sounds of my boots on the frozen duff, and the sound was consistent with the surface. I noted the calls of birds and the small movements of squirrels in the canopy, and the position of the sun. Everything was in order. Everything was, as far as I could determine, as it should have been. This did not reassure me. The sun and my shadow and the sounds of the forest had, in my experience, always been as they should have been. The fact that they were behaving correctly now did not refute the possibility that they would, again, behave incorrectly at some point in the immediate future. I had no model for what was happening, and therefore no way to predict when it might next happen, which is a deeply uncomfortable position for a person whose professional life is built on prediction. I made the junction with the Big East Fork Trail at 8:19 in the morning. I had originally planned to spend the second full day, October the 26th, working on the upper switchbacks of the old Butt Knob and camping again at Shining Rock Gap. I was now leaving the high country a day early. I want to record my reasoning for that decision because the question of whether I should have done so has come up in my own mind and in conversations with my supervisor several times since. I left because I was concerned that my judgment was being affected. Whatever had or had not happened in the night, the cumulative experience of the past 2 days had moved me from a state of professional inquiry into a state of low-grade hypervigilance. I was not sleeping. I was watching my own shadow. I was beginning to attach significance to ordinary sounds that, on a normal patrol, I would not have registered. A field officer in that state is a liability to himself and to anyone else who might depend on him. The responsible action was to descend to a lower elevation, get a good meal and a proper rest, and reevaluate whether to continue the assignment or hand the rest of the corridor off to a chainsaw crew with a partner. That was my reasoning at 8:19 on the morning of October the 26th, and I believe it was correct. The Big East Fork below the junction was easier walking, gradual and shaded, following the river back down toward the trailhead. I had perhaps 4.5 miles to cover. I told myself I would be at the truck by noon, and I would drive into Brevard, eat a hot lunch at the diner near the office, sleep for 4 hours in a real bed, and decide in the late afternoon whether to come back in. I did not get to the truck by noon. I will explain why. At 9:46 in the morning, perhaps half a mile below the junction, I came to a section of trail I had walked the previous morning. I recognized it by a particular curve of the river and by a fallen sycamore that I had not had time to clear, which lay across the river on the far bank in a distinctive arched shape. I remembered the sycamore clearly. I had noted it in my log on the way up, and I had photographed it because the bowl was beginning to host a colony of oyster mushrooms that I thought the Forest Health Survey might find interesting. I came around the curve, and the sycamore was not there. I stopped on the trail. I stood there for some time. The river curved exactly as I remembered it. The far bank was the same far bank, with the same exposed roots of standing alders, the same dark mossy stone at the waterline. The sycamore was not on the far bank. There was no sign that it had ever been on the far bank. The alders and stones occupied the space where its root mass had lain. There was no scar in the soil, no broken canes of rhododendron crushed beneath where the trunk had fallen, no rotted wood, no mushrooms. I took out my camera and reviewed the photographs I had made the previous morning. The sycamore was there in the photographs. I matched the curve of the river in the image against the curve in front of me. They were the same curve. The same dark stone was visible at the waterline in both. The same alder on the upstream side was visible in both. The sycamore in the photograph lay across the bank diagonally with its crown reaching out over the water. In front of me, there was nothing where the sycamore had been. I sat down on a stone at the trail's edge, and I looked at the photograph, and I looked at the bank, and I thought for a while about the various possibilities. The first possibility was that someone, in the 18 hours since I had passed this spot, had come in with a chainsaw and removed the sycamore. This was not credible. There had been no chainsaw noise audible from the upper trail or the campsite. A tree of that size, even cut into rounds, would have left obvious signs at the site. and the bank in front of me was undisturbed. There would have been sawdust. There was no sawdust. The second possibility was that I had walked past this curve and not yet reached the sycamore, that my memory of the distance had been compressed by the previous day's effort, and that the tree was still ahead of me on the trail. I did not believe this, but it was the only possibility that could be tested by continuing. I continued. I walked for another 40 minutes downstream. I did not encounter the sycamore. I encountered every other landmark I had recorded on the way up, in roughly the order I had recorded them. With 2 more photographs, I cross-checked against the bank in front of me, both of which matched perfectly. By 10:34, I was within a mile of the trailhead, and the sycamore had simply not appeared. I want to record one more detail from that morning because it has stayed with me. When I reached the second of the cross-checked landmarks, a particular outcrop of mossy stone where the trail bends across a small, dry feeder gully, the time on my watch was 10:21. The time on the metadata of the photograph I had taken at that spot the previous morning on the same camera was 10:21. The photographs are not made automatically. I had no reason, at the time, to register the time of either passage. The coincidence of those 2 times to the minute is, I am quite sure, statistically unremarkable. I record it because I noticed it then, and because, in the months since, I have noticed myself looking for those kinds of small synchronies and dismissing them, and I do not entirely trust either the looking or the dismissing. I reached the trailhead at 11:42 in the morning of October the 26th. The truck was where I had left it. The trailhead register was where I had left it. My pickup's odometer, which I checked by habit, read exactly what it had read when I parked. I performed my standard post-patrol routine. I removed my boots and changed into dry shoes. I weighed the pack by hand to confirm that I had used approximately the volume of water and food I expected to have used at this point in a patrol, which I had. I signed out at the register. I noted, on the line below my own outbound entry from the morning of October the 24th, that no other parties had signed in or out in the interval. This is normal for late October on that trailhead. I want to note it nonetheless. I had been the only person registered into that section of the wilderness for the entire period of my patrol. I drove into Brevard. I did not eat at the diner. I drove past the diner and continued to the district office, which I reached at 12:53. The duty officer that day was Marlene, who has been with the district almost as long as I have. She looked up when I came in and said something about my being back early, and I told her I would write it up shortly. She said that there was hot coffee, and I took some. I want to describe what I did in the office that afternoon, because the decisions I made about how to document what had happened and what not to document are part of the record I am now trying to set down honestly. I sat at the small table in the patrol room with my field log and my camera and a blank trip report form. I copied the routine information from the field log onto the form. The blowdowns I had cleared with their waypoints. The blowdowns I had flagged for the chainsaw crew with their waypoints. The condition of the trail surface and the drainage features. The note on the surviving hemlocks for the Forest Health Survey. The weather observations. I did not write down the knock at 9:31 on the first day. I did not write down the voice at 1:07. I did not write down the footsteps in the gravel that was not there. I did not write down the shadow on the ridge. I did not write down the silence at 1:42 in the morning, or the footsteps at 3:14, or the 4-minute and 12-second pause near the tent door, or the absence of any track in the duff at first light. I did not write down the missing sycamore. I want to be very honest about why I did not write down these things. It is easy in the months afterward to construct a story in which I considered them carefully and decided that they did not belong in a formal trip report because they were unverifiable. That is part of the truth. The fuller truth is that I did not want to write them down because writing them down would make them part of the record. And being part of the record would require me to discuss them with my supervisor. And discussing them with my supervisor would require me to take a position on whether I believed they had happened. And I did not, in that afternoon at the patrol room table, know how to take such a position. I left the trip report on the form as a routine entry. I signed it. I noted that I was returning early due to fatigue and would request a partner to complete the lower switchback assessment. I gave the form to Marlene. She did not ask what kind of fatigue. She has worked with rangers for a long time. I drove home. My wife was at her work, and I had the house to myself for a few hours. I made a sandwich and ate it standing at the kitchen counter. I poured a glass of water and drank it slowly. I went into the living room and sat on the couch and looked at the wall opposite me, where there is a framed topographic map of the southern Appalachians that I have looked at almost every day for the past 11 years. I sat there for a long time. I want to record one observation from that afternoon. When my wife came home, at approximately 5:30, she let herself in with her key, the way she always does, and she walked through the kitchen toward the living room, and she said my name in the way she does when she is checking that I'm home. I heard her boots on the kitchen tile. I heard her bag set down on the kitchen table. I heard her say my name. What I noticed was that all three sounds were present in their proper places. The boots on the tile sounded like boots on the tile. Her voice sounded like her voice, with the slight catch she has in it at the end of a long workday. There was a perfect, ordinary congruence between what I expected to hear and what I heard. I felt in that moment an enormous relief, and I felt at the same time a small, sharp, unaccustomed awareness that congruence between expectation and perception is not something I had ever before thought of as a thing that could fail. When she came into the living room and saw me, she stopped and said something to the effect of, "You look tired." I told her I was tired. I told her the patrol had not gone the way I had wanted it to, and that I would tell her about it later. She accepted this. We ate dinner together. We watched a program on the television. I went to bed early. I slept badly. I do not need to describe it. I think the reader can imagine. The next morning, October the 27th, I called the office and took a personal day. I told Marlene I was not feeling well. She said she would let the supervisor know. I do not know whether she suspected then that something more than fatigue was at issue, but she has never asked. I appreciate her for that. I drove out to a small parking pull-off above the Davidson River, perhaps 10 minutes from my house, and I sat in the truck, and I watched the water, and I tried to think. What I want to describe in this chapter is a thing I did the following week that I have come to regard as a mistake, although I am still not certain that it was, and that I am recording for completeness. On October the 31st, 6 days after my return from the old butt knob, I went back in. I went alone. I did not tell my supervisor. I did not sign the trailhead register. I told my wife I was going to do some scouting for the next season's volunteer work, which was a partial truth. I drove to the Big East Fork trailhead at 7:20 in the morning, parked the truck, and walked up the trail with a day pack and no overnight gear. I carried a camera, a notebook, and the radio. I left the personal locator beacon at home. I do not have a good reason for leaving the beacon. I think I did not want a record. The weather was different on the 31st. The sky was overcast with a low ceiling at perhaps 4,000 feet, and there was a steady cold drizzle starting around mid-morning. The temperature was in the low 40s at the trailhead and would have been near freezing on the ridge. I dressed for the weather. I made the junction with the old Butt Knob Trail at 9:55, which was slower than my pace on the 24th, partly because the drizzle made the wet leaves slick, and partly because I was stopping often. I was stopping often because I was looking for the sycamore. I found the curve of the river where the sycamore had been. I recognized it from the photograph I had brought with me as a print. The far bank was as it had been 6 days earlier when the sycamore was gone. No tree, no scar, no mushrooms. I stood there in the drizzle for perhaps 20 minutes. I photographed the bank from the same angle as the original photograph, with the camera held in approximately the same position. I compared the two images on the camera's small screen. They were identical except for the sycamore in the first and its absence in the second. I crossed the river. The crossing was not difficult, although the rocks were slick. I went up to the section of the far bank where the root mass of the sycamore would have rested. I knelt and pushed aside the leaf litter and the moss with my fingers. The soil beneath was undisturbed. There was no depression in the contour of the bank. There were no fragments of root. There was no buried wood. The earth had not been recently turned. It looked, in fact, like a piece of ground that had never had a large tree on it in the last 50 years. I want to record what I felt at this point because I think it matters. I felt a kind of cold clarity. I felt that I had come back to confirm something, and that I was now confirming it, and that confirmation was not the same as understanding. I did not understand what I was looking at. I understood that I was looking at it. I recrossed the river and continued up the trail. I want to be careful about the next part of what I describe, because I am aware that it is the part that is hardest to credit, and because I am also aware that by the time I reached the upper trail, I had been hiking in cold rain for over 3 hours, and was probably not at my sharpest. I will describe what I saw and let the reader make of it what they will. I reached the section of the old Butt Knob Trail where I had heard the footsteps in the gravel at 1:18 on October the 25th. I had marked it on my map. I checked the time. It was 12:47 in the afternoon, raining lightly, with a low cloud beginning to descend through the upper canopy. I stood at the spot and looked at the trail surface and listened. There were no footsteps. There were no sounds I could not identify. There was, instead, the steady patter of drizzle on the leaves still hanging on the lower hardwoods, the slow drip of accumulated moisture from the higher branches, the soft hiss of rain on the duff. These were exactly the sounds I would expect to hear in those conditions. The soundscape was, for lack of a better word, correct. I walked the section. I examined the trail surface carefully. The duff was wet, but undisturbed. There were no boot prints, other than my own freshly made ones. There were also no week-old boot prints with a horizontal bar across the heel. The older set of prints I had noted on the 25th were gone. This was easy to explain by the rain, which would have washed out partly dried prints in a few hours. But I had been looking for them. I continued up to the ridge. The cloud was now down to my level. Visibility on the open quartzite was perhaps 40 yards. The far view of Cold Mountain was gone, swallowed in gray. I stood on the rock where I had seen, or thought I had seen, my shadow lying in the wrong direction. There was no sun. There were no shadows at all. There was only the gray ceiling and the wet stone and the wind moving fog past me in slow, continuous sheets. I went back down the way I had come. I did not visit the campsite at Shining Rock Gap. I had no interest in standing on the patch of duff where the unseen footsteps had stopped. I went down off the ridge, descended the old Butt Knob in the rain, regained the Big East Fork Trail, and reached the truck at 5:11 in the afternoon in the last gray light. I was cold and wet and tired, and I was no further along in understanding anything than I had been when I started. I want to record one further thing from that day, although I am uncertain how much weight to put on it. When I got into the truck and started the engine, I sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel, letting the heater come up. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. I do not normally look at myself in the rearview mirror at the end of a hike. I had a thought, and the thought was simply that I wanted to see what I looked like. Because I had been alone in the rain for 9 hours, and I wanted to confirm something about my own appearance. I looked at my face in the mirror. I looked older than I had expected. There was a degree of pallor around the eyes and a slackness in the cheeks that I had not noticed in the bathroom mirror that morning. I noted it. I attributed it to fatigue and cold. I put the truck into gear and I drove home. It is only since then, looking at photographs of myself from before the patrol and after it, that I have noticed that the face in the rearview mirror on the evening of October the 31st was not the same face I have been carrying around since. The face I have been carrying around since looks somewhat younger, or perhaps not younger, but more present. The face in the mirror that evening looked in a way I cannot more precisely describe, like a face that had been displaced from something. I am not, in saying this, claiming that I have any reason to believe I was not myself in that moment. I am not. I am recording it because I noticed it, and because part of what I have been asked to do in writing this account is to record what I noticed. In the weeks following October the 31st, I made an attempt to return to my regular duties and to put what had happened in the Shining Rock Wilderness behind me. I was partly successful. I want to describe the partial nature of that success carefully, because it is the part of the experience I have had the most trouble articulating in conversation, and because writing it down is, I am told, supposed to help. The work itself was unaffected. I went into the office on November the 2nd, picked up the chainsaw crew assignment for the lower butt knob switchbacks, and worked it out with 2 other rangers and a contract sawyer over the course of 3 days, sleeping at the trailhead in my truck both nights. The crew handled the high country section that I had not finished. They did not, while they were up there, report anything unusual, I asked. I asked carefully, in the way you ask without seeming to be asking, and the answer was that the upper trail was fine. The campsite at Shining Rock Gap was as it should be, and there had been no sounds, sights, or experiences that anyone wanted to mention to anyone else over a beer. This was, on the face of it, reassuring. It suggested that whatever I had experienced had been particular to me and to the conditions of those 2.5 days. It suggested that the trail itself was not, as the saying goes, haunted. I have never believed that trails are haunted. I do not believe it now. What I believe, or what I have come slowly to believe, is more difficult to articulate. I believe that there are conditions under which the equipment we use to perceive the world fails in ways that we are not used to recognizing as failure. I believe that most of the time we do not notice this because the equipment fails in small ways and corrects itself before the conscious mind has registered the failure. I believe that occasionally, under conditions I do not understand, the failure becomes too large to be corrected silently, and the conscious mind notices it, and the conscious mind, which is not equipped to handle the noticing, attempts to explain what it has noticed in terms of objects in the world. A knock, a voice, a footstep, a missing tree. The objects in the world are easier to think about than the alternative, which is that the equipment itself has shown a crack, and that the world we have always trusted to be there in a particular way is, under those conditions, not quite there in that way. I find this idea difficult. I find it more difficult than I would have found the idea of a creature in the woods, or of a haunted place, or of any of the explanations that the people who have asked me about these events have offered. A creature in the woods is a thing that can be searched for, hunted, photographed, or avoided. A haunted place is a place that can be left alone. A failure in the equipment of perception is a thing that travels with you. It is in you, and it is in me, and it has been in me, I believe, for as long as I have been alive, and it will be in me for the rest of my life. The only thing that changed in those 2.5 days was that I noticed it. I have not, since October, had another experience comparable to what I had on the old Butt Knob. There has been nothing like the silence at 1:42 in the morning. There has been nothing like the footsteps at 3:14. There has been nothing like the shadow on the ridge or the missing sycamore. My ordinary life, in all of its sensory detail, has continued in the way it has always continued. What has changed, and what I want to record, is the quality of my attention to that life. I notice the sound of my own boots on the tile in the kitchen now. I notice the small click of the light switch in the bedroom in the morning. I notice the way the shadows of the maple in the front yard move across the driveway in the afternoon. I notice the cadence of my wife's voice when she comes home, and the way her bag sounds when she sets it down on the kitchen table. I notice these things in a way I did not notice them before, and the noticing is not exactly anxious. It is more like a kind of low, constant gratitude. Each ordinary congruence between what I expect and what I perceive is, for me, a small confirmation that the equipment is, for now, working. I do not say any of this to my wife. I do not say it to my supervisor. I have said some of it to my doctor, the man I have had as a primary care physician for the past 15 years, when he asked me at my annual exam in early November whether I had been sleeping well. I told him I had not been sleeping as well as I would like, and that I was managing it. He asked me whether there was a particular reason. I told him that there was something I had been thinking about, and that I would tell him about it if it persisted into the new year. He let it go. I appreciate him for that. I want to record one more thing about the aftermath, and then I will conclude. In late November, I received in the mail a small envelope addressed to me at the district office, with no return address, postmarked from a town in eastern Tennessee that I have never visited. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper, folded once. On the paper, in pencil, in a handwriting I did not recognize, was written a single sentence. The sentence read, "Did you hear it walking around the tent?" There was no signature. There was no other text on the paper. The sheet had been torn from a small notebook, the kind of thing many people carry, with no distinguishing marks on the back. I have considered, since receiving this letter, every possibility I can think of. The most likely is that one of the rangers or volunteers I have worked with over the years has heard, through the small grapevine of our district, that I came back early from the Shining Rock Patrol and was rattled, and has decided to play a joke on me. This is possible. I do not particularly find it funny, and the people I have worked with for a long time are not generally cruel, but I am willing to accept the possibility. The second possibility is that there is a person who has experienced something comparable to what I experienced in some other place at some other time, and that this person has heard through some channel that I have had a difficult patrol, and that this person is reaching out in a clumsy and anonymous way. This is also possible. I would, if I could identify this person, want to speak with them. The third possibility is one I have not been able to dismiss, and that I will not put into words, because putting it into words would require me to take a position on a matter on which I have not yet, after all of this time, taken a position. I have kept the letter. It is folded in the back of my field notebook, with the entries from October the 24th, October the 25th, and October the 26th. I look at it sometimes. I do not respond to it, because there is no return address. I do not destroy it. I am not sure why I do not destroy it. Perhaps because destroying it would feel like an answer, and I am not ready to answer. I want, in this chapter, to go back and describe one further event from the night of October the 25th that I left out of the earlier account, because I was not sure when I was writing the earlier chapters whether I wanted to include it. I have decided to include it. I have decided to include it because the account is incomplete without it, and because the purpose of writing this down, as my supervisor has said, is to set it down as fully and as honestly as I can. I omitted, from the description of the silence and the footsteps, the brief period between the cessation of the footsteps and the return of normal sound at 5:50 in the morning. I implied in the earlier account that I lay in the tent in silence for the remainder of the night, and that nothing further occurred until the chickadee call at first light. This is not, strictly speaking, true. Something further did occur, although I have considerable uncertainty about its nature, and the uncertainty is part of why I left it out. At approximately 4:30 in the morning of October the 26th, I became aware of a smell. The smell was faint at first, and it came into the tent slowly in the way that a smell comes in when something has been placed near the upwind side of a shelter and the air is moving very gently. The temperature outside was now well below freezing, and the air, what little of it was moving, was cold and dry. The smell would not normally have carried well in those conditions, and I think I noticed it only because I had been lying for over 2 hours in the kind of attention that magnifies small sensory inputs. I want to describe the smell carefully because I have thought about it many times, and I have never been able to settle on what it was. It was not the smell of any animal I have known in the woods. It was not the muskier smell of a bear, the wet dog smell of a coyote at close range, the faint, sharp scent of a fox. It was not the smell of decay, which I am familiar with from my work, and which I would have recognized immediately. It was not the smell of smoke, of cooking, of any plant or fungus in season at that elevation in late October. It was, instead, a smell of something cold and very faintly metallic, with an organic undertone that I have not been able to place. The closest comparison I can offer, and I offer it knowing that it does not really capture it, is the smell of an old basement after a long rain, when the masonry has been damp for weeks, and there is a thin trace of mineral in the air, and underneath that, there is the very faint, almost not there suggestion of something living that has been in the basement for too long. It was that kind of smell, only colder and out of place, in a high spruce forest in October. The smell persisted for approximately 20 minutes. It came in gradually, reached a kind of stable low intensity, and then faded over the course of perhaps 10 more minutes until I could not detect it anymore. I want to record that I did not get out of the tent to investigate the source of the smell. I had spent the entire night in the tent, and I had no intention of leaving it until first light. Whatever the smell was, I was content to let it remain unidentified. After the smell faded, I lay in the bag and I tried again to think. I considered for the first time the possibility that the entire sequence of events, going back to the knock at 9:31 on the first day, was an artifact of my own internal state. I considered the possibility that I had developed somewhere along the way some kind of mild neurological condition that was producing intermittent perceptual disturbances, and that the events I had been carefully recording in my log were not events in the world at all, but events in me. I considered, with as much honesty as I could manage at 4 in the morning in a freezing tent, what the implications of that possibility would be. The implications were not negligible. A man who is experiencing perceptual disturbances of that kind should not be working alone in the backcountry. He should not be operating a vehicle on mountain roads. He should not be making the kinds of decisions about safety and route finding that my work requires of me daily. If I accepted the internal state hypothesis, I would have to take it to my supervisor and to my doctor. and I would have to face the possibility of being pulled from the field for as long as it took to investigate. I am 50 miles from the nearest large hospital and 20 years into a career I have built carefully and that I love. The cost of accepting that hypothesis would be considerable. I considered also whether the cost should affect my willingness to accept it. I decided that it should not. If the equipment of my perception was failing, the cost of pretending it was not failing would be far greater than the cost of pulling myself out of the field. I decided, lying in the tent at 4:50 in the morning, that I would make an appointment with my doctor on my next office day and tell him, as much as I could bring myself to tell him, about what had happened. I would let him decide what to do with the information. I want to record that I did not, in fact, do this. I told my doctor, when I saw him in early November, only that I had not been sleeping well. I did not tell him about the knock, the voice, the gravel, the shadow, the silence, the footsteps, the smell, or the missing sycamore. I did not tell him about the letter. I told him I had been thinking about something and would mention it again if it persisted, and I let him let me go. I want to record also that I have wondered since whether my decision not to tell him was driven by my judgment that the symptoms had stopped and that further investigation was not warranted, or whether it was driven by a less defensible reluctance to be the kind of man who tells his doctor things like this. I do not know the answer. I would like to believe it was the first. I am not, at this point, willing to swear that it was not the second. At 5:50, the chickadee called. The barred owl answered, much farther off. The sound floor of the forest began very gradually to return. The smell had been gone for an hour. The silence began to break up into the ordinary, irregular textures of pre-dawn. I lay in the bag and I listened, and the listening was no longer the watchful, terrified listening of the small hours, but something almost like the listening of a man hearing music that he had been afraid he would not hear again. I sat up at 6:14. I broke down the tent. I packed the bear bag. I drank a cold cup of water, and I ate 2 energy bars because I did not want to take the time to boil water for breakfast. I started down the trail at 6:51. The rest of the descent I have already described. There is one more event I have not yet recorded, and it is the most recent of the events I will record in this account. It took place on the evening of January the 8th of this year, which is approximately 10 weeks after my return from the Shining Rock Wilderness. I am writing this in the middle of January, so the event is recent enough that I have not had time to fully integrate it into my thinking, and the reader should weigh my account of it accordingly. I was on the evening of January the 8th at home. It was a Thursday. My wife was at a dinner with her sister and would not be back until late. I had eaten a simple supper alone and had spent an hour or so in the living room reading a magazine. The house was warm. The thermostat was set to 68 degrees. There was a low wind outside, the kind that moves the bare branches of the maple in the yard without doing anything more than that. The temperature outside was in the upper 20s. At approximately 8:40 in the evening, I got up from the couch to refill my water glass. The kitchen is at the back of the house, and the path from the couch to the kitchen takes me past the bottom of the stairs that lead up to the second floor. The stairs are wooden, and they creak in particular places when they are walked on, and I know which places creak because I have lived in this house for 11 years. As I passed the bottom of the stairs, I heard one of the upper stairs creak, the third stair from the top. It is a particular creak, somewhat hollow, and I know it well because it is the stair my wife always lands on when she comes down in the morning before I do. I stopped at the foot of the stairs. I looked up. The stairwell was dark. The light at the top of the stairs was off as I had left it. There was no one on the stairs. I stood there for perhaps a minute. The stair did not creak again. The house was otherwise silent except for the faint sound of the furnace in the basement. which I could hear running quietly at its usual low level. I turned on the stairwell light. I went up the stairs slowly. I walked down the upstairs hallway. I looked into each of the rooms. The bedroom was empty. The guest room was empty. The bathroom was empty. The small office at the end of the hall was empty. There was no one in the house but me. I came back down. I stood again at the foot of the stairs with the stairwell light on, and I looked up at the third stair from the top. I considered for some time what I was looking at. The most likely explanation, by a large margin, was that the wooden stair had contracted in the cold and produced a small creak on its own. Wooden stairs do this. I have heard them do it many times. It is not, ordinarily, a sound I would notice or remark on. The reason I had noticed it on this particular evening was that the cadence of the creak had been the precise cadence of a foot stepping on the stair. There had been no slow, drawn-out adjustment of dry wood. There had been one short, weighted, downward compression of the third stair from the top, with the exact quality and the exact duration that the stair makes when my wife is on it. I want to record what I did next, because I think it is one of the more honest things I have done in the months since October. I did not go through the house with a flashlight. I did not call out. I did not call my wife. I did not call the police. I turned off the stairwell light. I went into the kitchen. I refilled my water glass at the sink. I came back into the living room. I sat down on the couch. I picked up the magazine I had been reading. I continued reading. I was not pretending that I had not heard the stair. I had heard it. I was simply choosing, by an act of will, not to permit the hearing of it to take over the rest of my evening. I had spent the past 2.5 months noticing every small sensory event in my immediate environment with a kind of quiet vigilance that had not, in the end, served me. The vigilance had not produced understanding. The vigilance had only produced more vigilance. I was tired of being a man whose attention to his own house was so finely tuned that he could not refill a glass of water without conducting an internal investigation. I read the magazine. I finished it. I put it down. I watched a program on television. I went upstairs at approximately 10:15, brushed my teeth, and went to bed. My wife came home at 11:30. She came in quietly, undressed quietly, and got into bed without waking me, or so she thought. I had not been asleep. I had not gone to sleep until I heard her downstairs, and I had pretended to be asleep when she came in because I did not want to make her feel that she had disturbed me. She fell asleep almost immediately, in the way she does. I listened to her breathing for a while, was steady and even. I fell asleep sometime after midnight. The next morning, on January the 9th, I went down to the kitchen first. My wife came down a few minutes later. She landed on the third stair from the top with the exact creak I had heard the night before. I was at the counter making coffee. I did not turn around. I did not say anything. I poured her a cup of coffee in the way I always do, and she came up beside me, and she kissed me on the side of the face, and I felt, for the first time in a long while, something close to ordinary peace. I will record one final observation about that morning. While I was pouring her coffee, I noticed, in a way I have learned over the past months to notice, the congruence between the sounds in the kitchen and what I knew to be happening in the kitchen. The sound of the coffee pouring matched the sight of the coffee pouring. The smell of the coffee matched the steam. The light through the window above the sink fell across the counter and across my hand in a way that was geometrically consistent with the position of the sun at that hour of a January morning. My shadow on the wall was where it should have been. I noticed all of this. I noticed it with the kind of low, persistent gratitude I described earlier in this account. And I noticed also, in a smaller and harder-to-place way, that I will probably go on noticing it for the rest of my life. That is, I believe, the lasting consequence of what happened in the Shining Rock Wilderness on the night of October the 25th. Not fear, not disability, not even particularly doubt. Only a permanent change in the texture of my attention to the world. A change that, in the months since, has felt at times like a burden, and at other times like a kind of unwanted gift. I want to use this chapter to address a question that has been put to me in various forms by the few people I have told some version of this story. The question is whether I believe what I have described actually happened in the world outside of me. I have answered the question differently on different days, and I want to set down, for the record, the answer I am most willing to defend at the time of this writing. I do not know. I want to be precise about what I mean by not knowing. I do not mean that I am suspending judgment because I am afraid to commit to an answer. I am committed to the not knowing. The not knowing is, I have come to believe, the only honest position available to me, given the evidence I have and the kind of evidence it is. Consider what the evidence consists of. There are entries in a field log written in my own hand, recording sounds and observations made by a single observer with no instruments other than his own senses and a wristwatch. There are photographs of a trail and a riverbank, the second of which differs from the first in the absence of a tree, with no physical evidence at the site to confirm that the tree was ever there other than the earlier photograph. There is a letter, anonymous, postmarked from a town I have never been to, asking a question to which I have no way to respond. There is the memory of a silence and a sequence of footsteps and a smell, none of which were observed by anyone else, none of which left any physical trace. If a colleague brought me this evidence and asked me what to make of it, I would tell him that the evidence is consistent with several different possible explanations, and that without additional data we cannot adjudicate between them. I would tell him that the most parsimonious explanation, the one that requires us to revise the fewest of our prior beliefs about how the world works, is that the observer experienced a sequence of perceptual disturbances, possibly related to fatigue, dehydration, hypothermia, or some other unrecognized internal condition, and that the disturbances were sufficiently vivid that they were taken to be observations of external events. I would tell him that the second most parsimonious explanation, which is harder to reconcile with our prior beliefs, but is not strictly impossible, is that some local condition of the environment in that part of the wilderness, perhaps an acoustic anomaly or some atmospheric or geological effect not currently well understood, produced a series of effects that the observer perceived in the way described. I would tell him that the third and least parsimonious explanation is that something occurred in that part of the wilderness that does not fit within our current understanding of the natural world, and that to accept this explanation, we would have to do considerable violence to our prior beliefs, which would require very strong evidence indeed, which we do not have. I have given my colleague that advice many times over the years. I have given it in writing, in reports, in informal conversations with younger rangers who have come to me with stories from their own patrols. I have always believed in the advice. I believe in it now. What is different now is that I am the observer. I am the man with the photographs and the field log and the letter, and the difficulty of being the observer, which I had not entirely appreciated when I was giving the advice to others, is that the parsimonious explanation, while almost certainly correct, asks me to commit myself to a particular belief about my own internal state during those 2.5 days. It asks me to believe that I, a healthy, rested, experienced man of 47, with no history of any psychiatric or neurological condition, generated within myself a sequence of perceptual events of such specificity and consistency that even now, in this office, at this desk on a January afternoon, when I close my eyes, I can hear the third stair creak with the exact cadence of my wife's foot. I can hear it without effort. I can hear the silence at 1:42 in the morning, the way it felt against the inside of my ears. I can hear the footstep in the duff outside the tent. I can smell the cold metallic smell at 4:30. These are not vague memories. They are sharp, durable, specific impressions of a kind that I have in my professional experience only ever produced by direct observation of external events. The parsimonious explanation, in other words, asks me to believe that my own perceptual system is capable of producing, without any external input, impressions of this quality. Maybe it is. Probably, given what I know about the parsimonious explanation, it is. But it is a fact about me that I had not, before October, considered, and it is a fact that I find, even now, difficult to absorb. The alternative is to accept that something happened in the world, outside of me, that I cannot account for. I am not willing to take that step. The cost of taking it would be too high. To accept, even tentatively, that things can happen in the world that do not fit our current understanding of it is to open a door that I am not, professionally or temperamentally, prepared to walk through. I am not, I think, a coward about this. I am simply a man who has chosen, for his own reasons, to keep that door closed. And so I remain in the middle. I do not say that nothing happened. I do not say that something happened. I say that I had an experience, the precise nature of which I cannot determine, and that the experience has left a mark on me that I am still learning to live with. This is, I think, the honest position. It is not a comfortable position, but I have learned in 19 years of field work that the comfortable position and the honest position are rarely the same one. I will not, in this account, offer a final conclusion. I do not have one. I do not think I will ever have one. The point of writing this down, my supervisor told me, is not to reach a conclusion, but to set the experience down in a form where it can be looked at by me and by anyone else with a legitimate reason to look. I have done that as well as I can. The reader, if there is a reader, may make of it what they will. I will close this account with a few practical notes and one small final observation. The practical notes are these. The old Butt Knob Trail remains open and is, as far as the district is aware, in good condition. The chainsaw crew completed the assessment in early November, and there are no current advisories on that section of the wilderness. I have not requested that the trail be closed or that any unusual measures be taken in regard to it. I would not be able to justify such a request on the evidence I have. The trail is a normal trail. The campsite at Shining Rock Gap is a normal campsite. The river curves in its normal way past the bank where the sycamore was or was not. There is no reason, on any official basis, for any other ranger or hiker to treat that section of wilderness any differently than they would treat any other section. I have continued my own duties. I have not returned to the Shining Rock Wilderness since October the 31st, but this is not, I believe, because I am avoiding it. It is because the wildernesses I cover are large, and my work has taken me elsewhere in the past 3 months. I expect to be back there at some point in the spring when the schedule calls for it. I do not know how I will feel about that when the time comes. I imagine I will be more attentive than I would have been before. I do not imagine I will be afraid. Fear, in my experience, is largely a function of expecting something specific. And I no longer expect anything specific. I only expect, in a low and steady way, to continue noticing. I have not, since the letter in late November, received any further anonymous correspondence. I have not sought out the sender. I have considered whether I should write up a brief account of the letter for the file, and have decided not to. The letter is in my notebook where it will remain. I have not told my wife the whole of what happened. I have told her enough that she knows the patrol was difficult, and that I have been thinking about it more than I would like. She has asked, on a few occasions, whether there is something more I want to talk about. I have said that there is, and that I will tell her when I can. She has accepted this with the patience that she has always shown me. I would like to say here, where she will probably never read it, that her patience with me on this matter has been a gift I have not deserved and that I am grateful for. The final observation is this. I have been sitting at the desk in my home office while I have been writing this account, over a period of several days. The office is on the second floor of the house, in the small room at the end of the upstairs hallway. The window of the office faces east, toward a stand of oaks in the backyard. The afternoon I have been writing this final chapter, the light through the window has been the pale, clear light of mid-January, falling across the desk and across my hands and across the page. I have looked up several times to rest my eyes in the way I always do when I'm writing. Each time I have looked up, I have looked at my own hand on the desk, and I have watched the shadow of the hand fall across the wood in the direction the sun would have it fall. I have looked at the shape of the shadow and compared it to the shape of the hand. I have looked at the wall opposite the window, where the framed map of the southern Appalachians hangs, and I have watched the corners of the frame cast their own small shadows in their correct places. I have done this on perhaps a dozen separate occasions over the course of writing this account. Each time, the shadows have been where they should be. Each time, I have made a small note of it, somewhere internal, and have returned to my work. I do not know if I will continue to do this for the rest of my life. I think I probably will. I do not know if other people who have had experiences like mine, if there are such people, develop similar habits, or if there is some other way of carrying what we carry. I would like to think that there are others, that the letter from Tennessee in November was the first sign of a quiet community of people scattered through the country who have looked up from their desks or their kitchens or their tents and have noticed something out of place and have learned to live with the noticing. I would like to think that, but I cannot prove it. What I can prove by writing it down is that one such person exists. His name is Daniel Herzog. He is a backcountry ranger with the United States Forest Service assigned to the Pisgah Ranger District. He is 47 years old. He went into the Shining Rock Wilderness on the morning of October the 24th of this past year on a routine 5-day patrol and came out a day and a half later having heard something he cannot identify, having seen something he cannot account for, and having stood for a period he cannot precisely measure in a silence that should not have been there. He does not know what it was. He does not, on his more honest days, expect ever to know. He notices now. That is what he has in place of an answer. He notices the world around him, and he is grateful when the world matches what he expects of it, and he is watchful when it does not. And he is going to go on doing this until something makes him stop. He is, in all the other ways that matter, well. He is glad to be home. He is glad to hear his wife on the stairs in the morning. He is glad of the steady congruence of light and shadow and sound in his ordinary life. He is glad also, in a smaller way, that there is one place in the world where, for a few hours on a single night, that congruence faltered, because the faltering has taught him to notice the congruence the rest of the time. He is not sure he would have learned this any other way. He has set this account down because he was asked to. He has tried to be honest. He has tried to leave out nothing relevant and to add nothing he cannot defend. He understands that there will be readers who will conclude, on the evidence, that he experienced a series of internal events that he mistook for external ones, and he accepts this as the most likely interpretation. He understands that there will be readers who will conclude, on the same evidence, that he encountered something in those woods for which there is no current explanation, and he accepts this as a possibility he cannot rule out. He is at peace with both readings. He is mostly at peace. He is going to put down the pen now and close the notebook and go downstairs and pour a glass of water at the kitchen sink and listen for a moment to the sound the water makes as it fills the glass. He is going to listen because he wants to. He is going to listen because the sound is there, and because he is there to hear it, and because, after what happened in the Shining Rock Wilderness, both of those things are, to him, a small and continuous kind of mercy. He does not expect anything to be wrong. He does not, in particular, expect anything to be right. He expects only to hear the water and to be glad of the hearing. That is the end of the account.